We'll be starting in about 30 seconds. Those sitting at the back, may I please invite you to come a little bit closer to the front in case anyone else may join us. Can we say something? Great. I think we can get started. Good afternoon, all. Thank you so much for making time to join us today for the launch of the Advocating for Rights-Based Climate Investment Plans in Developing Nations to Realize a Just Transition. So today we'll be launching that report, and the people launching it, the host of today's launch are the Climate Ambition to Accountability Project. And that is a partnership between three institutions. So the Institute for Economic Justice, who are on the screen, WWF, and South African Climate Action Network. This is a partnership that is co-funded by the European Union and CEDA. My name is Pato Kilisidze. I'm the Climate Action and Sustainability Lead at South African Climate Action Network, and I will be your moderator for today's launch and panel discussion. To introduce you to the session, so to date, the mobilization of adequate climate finance is a crucial ingredient to the achievement of the just energy transition. The decisions made regarding climate finance in any given country will have a profound impact on the trajectory of the energy transition and the socio-economic and socio-environmental development and the nation. However, rather unfortunately, climate investments are often complex, technical, lack transparency, and deliberately exclude the affected communities and workers in their formulation and implementation. As a result, civil society organizations and some labor constituencies are left with limited understanding and participation in these matters. The report that we'll be launching today, that has been spearheaded by IEJ, they have begun to develop a rights-based approach to just energy transition partnerships and the funding for them. And we'll find out a little bit more in a few seconds when the lead author, the author, not even just the lead, when the author of this report, Ms. Yasira Mahdi, takes us through it in a brief presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand over to Yasira Mahdi, who is the author of the report, to give us a little bit of a peek inside. Please give her a huge round of applause.
Okay, thank you so much, Pato. Okay, so as Pato mentioned, while we wait for the slides to come up, I'll be presenting on our rights-based approach to climate finance working paper and a little bit about the motivation for why we decided to do this paper. As Pato sort of laid out the grounds for us, is that there's increasing financing coming into South Africa specifically, but a lot of other countries through JETP deals that are being made. And these are sort of ruined by rights violations, and depending on how the sources and instruments of financing, it can really affect the trajectory of justice. So that's a little bit about the motivation. If we can go to the next slide, we begin this process. Oh, I have a clicker. Cool. We begin this process by defining what a rights-based approach is, which is a conceptual framework that is normatively based on international human rights standards and operationally directed to promoting and protecting human rights. And the aim of it is to analyze obligations, inequalities, and vulnerabilities, and to redress discriminatory practices and unjust distributions of power that impede progress and undercut human rights. So in order to find the international human rights standards, we looked at three main documents. So the first one was the International Bill of Human Rights. We looked at the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but mainly we extracted our principles from the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights because they define the state's obligations to financing rights realization. We then extracted principles from the guidelines on foreign debt and human rights just because so much of climate financing is currently being mobilized as debt, and we need principles that allow these, that can hold these loans accountable and maintain the regulation of them. Finally, we looked at the climate agreements, so the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC agreements, and we extracted these principles that are embedded in these agreements that guide climate financing. And then, in order to frame our analysis, we looked at the billions to trillions agenda, which is an increasingly prominent concept that's been used in financing, not just climate financing, to do our analysis. So what it is, it was initially introduced by the World Bank during the Millennium Development Goals, but really it became prominent during the Sustainable Development Goal era. And what it is it's an approach to leverage public finance to stimulate the mobilization of trillions of dollars in private investment, essentially aiming to bridge the gap in development financing. And this billions to trillions agenda aligns closely to what Daniela Gabor terms the Wall Street consensus, which promotes a strategy that seeks to create investment opportunities in impoverished countries that can attract global institutional investors and align their activities with the SDG ambitions. But the Wall Street consensus essentially exploits the climate crisis for financial gain, benefiting financial markets and institutions. And we can see that the billions to trillions agenda is embedded in many international financial institutions or climate frameworks. For example, the Green Climate Fund talks to de-risking strategies in the effort to mobilize enough private resourcing. Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank talks about the cascade approach, which is maximizing finance for development by prioritizing private solutions and supporting de-risking. And also the Addis Ababa agenda talks to unlocking the transformative potential or creating an enabling environment for the private sector. We're seeing that the JATPs are doing a similar trajectory. They pushing privatization and public-private partnerships. But just to illustrate how de-risking can look, or what privatization of public goods looks like, on the left we have a state-based, I'm not moving anything. Oh, those are the principles, by the way. Sorry about that. Those are the principles we've identified. I didn't go into them. I just mentioned the three documents that we extracted from because we'll touch on some of them. And then this is the billions to trillions agenda. And then now we are here. So on the left, we can see that states are investing in a state-based approach would look like this, which is states invest in green public infrastructure, essentially creating jobs in the process, providing services to their citizens, and then citizens pay taxes, and the private sector is involved secondarily to finance what needs to be financed. But in a de-risking agenda on the right is the state will try to create a fertile ground in order to attract private investment. And a lot of that looks like assuming the risks of the private sector, so assuming the demand risks or the climate risks or the political risks in order to give the private sector some assurance to finance the infrastructure. And once it does that, the private sector now has user fees in order to cover the cost of its infrastructure, the full cost of the infrastructure, but also to maintain its profitability. So citizens then have to pay user fees, and this is obviously exclusionary because it cuts out citizens. But the government tries to cover this up through cash transfers, but it's not always fully. It doesn't cover fully the the variation there. So this can violate certain principles, like the principle of non-retrogression, because the state is not supposed to go back on rights that it was already realizing. Once you go to a private model, that could happen. The right to minimum core obligations of essential rights. This exclusionary measure of providing public goods means that not all citizens are getting that right to minimum core obligations. But essentially, under this paradigm, states are passing on their responsibilities towards the rights realization to other actors who prioritize profits over social, environmental, and economic goods, and therefore resource allocation is then skewed, and they may not prioritize rights realization. And this is also because only a few sectors are attractive to private investment, which is only interested in so-called investable or bankable projects rather than projects that may advance rights more. And that's why, so because the state is offsetting its obligations to a party that doesn't have any binding obligations in the international space, it's taking a step back on its rights to obligations to take steps towards financing rights realization. It's also not violating its maximum amount of available resources that it's supposed to be mobilizing, because PPP can often be because instead of financing these public goods, it's guaranteeing private debt. So that's just one example of the billions to trillions agenda undermining human rights and how we've applied these principles. I'm going to go through two more, but then I'm sure the panel will bring out other principles, and then the working paper is there for everyone to read that goes into depth with many of them. So the use of private finance in the provision of public goods opens states up to the use of international investment treaties at the multilateral. Sorry, guys. Okay, we just missed one slide. Cool. Sorry. So yes, the use of private finance in the provision of public goods opens states up to the use of international investment treaties at the multilateral and bilateral level. So bilateral investment treaties, or BITs, is an agreement between two countries that establishes the terms and conditions for foreign investment protection and promotion. These treaties typically aim to provide certain rights and protections to investors from one country, the home state, that invest in the other country, the host state. So foreign investors are then afforded the opportunity to be claimants against the state, but the state, however, can only appeal the decision made by the court. And these tribunal processes possesses the authority to impose substantial financial compensation provided to investors by the state to enforce specific regulatory obligations. And part of this is, for example, if the state wants to block any new fossil fuel projects, they may be fined hefty amounts from these investment treaties, even if that fossil fuel project was just in its startup phase or hadn't even been developed. The state can be fined for the projected profits. So this undermines rights realizations in many ways. The duty of international cooperation among states is violated, ensuring that a state has an independent process of national development, because these fines prohibit states from making their own decisions on the trajectory of their development in the fear of being penalized. And similarly, country-owned strategies. So because fossil fuels are maybe, blocking fossil fuels is being fined, it undermines the country-owned, it undermines the ability of the state to own its strategy of its climate trajectory. So all of these things essentially undermine national responsibility or national sovereignty of the country. Similarly, something like structural adjustment programs, which is now, I think, known as development policy operations, which are operations involve providing financial support that is linked to the adoption and implementation of policies known as prior actions. So essentially conditions attached to a loan before it's given. So an example of this is during the pandemic, the World Bank lent South Africa 750 million, and the South African government committed to a range of conditionalities proposed by the World Bank, which put forward a macroeconomic framework of fiscal consolidation. So these conditionalities included things like cutting red tape that would create an enabling environment for the private sector, enhancing their role in public utilities, and enabling private sector procurement by municipalities, and determining the speed of the just transition in the country. Again, ripping the countries of their autonomy and pushing this agenda of the Wall Street consensus. So again, the rights violations there is you ripping the country from owning its climate trajectory and determining its own climate trajectory by influencing it through conditionalities on loans. There's also human rights agreements to avoid conditionalities altogether and to ensure that countries have policy formulation and implementation freedom. So that's the rights that are being violated there. But yeah, to sum up, like I mentioned, these are just some of the rights that we've identified in the working paper. And you can see that despite the existence of the comprehensive and well-crafted human rights norms, the real impact is then limited by a lack of enforcement and genuine consequences. So there's a gap between writing principles, the written principles, and the implementation of these principles. And so we're proposing that going forward, we can develop tools that may help to support social movements and civil societies in their advocacy for just transition financing regimes as a means of closing this gap. So asking questions like if PPPs are being implemented and are in the JECP deals and the government is rolling them out, what do we as civil society do? Is there regulations or accountability that we can advocate for, or is there a public pathway that we can advocate for? So we're proposing a research agenda that tries to surface those questions about what we could do about these rights violations, but hopefully that's work for the future. But for now, I think that's it, and I'll leave it to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasira. Again, can we please have a huge round of applause for the author of today's report? Thank you for that, Yasira. She laid the foundation for the conversation that we'll have in today's event, where we're looking to facilitate a thoughtful discussion on some of the rights-based principles on financing, focusing on their relevance in the distinctive context of JETP deals, financing decisions, and the trajectories. Additionally, we're looking to explore the implications within the energy transition landscape across the various recipient countries. The countries that will be represented on the panel that we have today are South Africa, being the first one that received it, Senegal, and Indonesia. Indonesia will be joining us online. I hope she's with us. And to get the conversation started, I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage. We have got Bima from Acelios, who's on technological transfer. We've got Ibrima Dia from Senegal, who is with the Innovation, Environment and Development of Africa, and he is the Natural Resource and Land Governance Program Manager. And we've also got Thando Lwetu Lukuko, who is the coordinator of the South African Climate Action Network. And joining us online is, oh yes, I did. Thank you so much. So as they speak, they'll be speaking from the different contexts of their countries, knowing that even just geographically, they're different, economically, they're different, and even the deals they got have differences in them. I'd like to start with Ibrahima. A key human rights cluster in the working group paper is procedural fairness. Can you please speak to, you've got your microphones? Great. Can you please speak both to what transparency and public participation have looked like in the Senegalese Just Energy Transition Partnership, and if you could give us key examples of civil society advocating against some of these injustices that have come forward during the process. Ibrahima?
It's on. Thank you a lot. My name is Ibrahima, and I'm so sorry to not be able to speak in English. And my friend Roland will translate for me, and it will help me to explain fluently what I want to say. I'm sorry.
So Ibrahima's first language is French, so Ibrahima will be speaking in French, and one of the panelists will also be translating, because civil society, we hold hands and make sure that the message, you get the message. Please go ahead. You're welcome to speak in French.
Merci beaucoup pour cette invitation. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'être là en tant que membre de la société civile du Sénégal, de partager cette session avec des collègues africains de l'Afrique du Sud pour partager sur une thématique cruciale qui est cette question donc de JETP, qui est aujourd'hui très largement discutée, surtout au niveau de cette COP. Donc ce sera un plaisir de revenir sur le processus au Sénégal. Vous êtes certainement au courant du processus qui a été entamé au Sénégal depuis juin 2023, où l'État du Sénégal a signé une convention ou un contrat avec l'Union européenne, l'Allemagne, la France, la Grande-Bretagne et également le Canada pour accompagner le gouvernement du Sénégal à accélérer son processus pour rendre l'énergie universelle, mais également donc pour rendre les efforts du Sénégal dans le cadre du système énergétique beaucoup plus sobre et beaucoup plus résilient. Il faut rappeler que malgré ce processus qui est engagé, il y a quand même une réalité qui est là chez nous et qui est assez peut-être un peu malheureux. C'est une exclusion assez particulière de la société civile dans le processus de formulation de cette contractualisation entre l'État du Sénégal et les partenaires internationaux donc engagés dans le cadre de ce processus. Et le lancement a été fait en novembre passé. Et la société civile a été impliquée dans le cadre de cet atelier de lancement. Et nous en sommes là. Donc le processus est encore très fermé, il faut le rappeler, et peut-être on reviendra, en permettant à Roland de faire une petite synthèse, on reviendra sur les autres aspects.
Yes, so thank you for inviting us to be here. It's a pleasure for the Senegalese civil society to be here with you today to share about this topic, which is really very important, and we're talking about it a lot more at the moment. As you know, on June 23 this year, Senegal also signed its own JETP, and it was done really without civil society. And until now, the process has been very nebulous because civil society has not really been involved, and the terms of the deal that was signed with more or less the same partners, France, the US, the EU, and others, Germany, really the terms and conditions of this deal are not really known to the wider public, and civil society still is outside of the process.
Et rajouter un tout petit peu, ce dont nous, société civile, nous sommes au courant, c'est par rapport au montant. Donc on parle de 2,5 milliards d'euros qui seront mis en œuvre entre 3 et 5 ans avec de potentielles ressources additionnelles. Mais ce qu'il faut constater est que la société civile n'est pas encore au courant du contenu de cette contractualisation et nous ne pouvons pas exactement comprendre qu'est-ce qui a été partagé dans le cadre de ce document de contractualisation, quels sont les engagements de l'État du Sénégal, quelle est la contrepartie. Par contre, nous avons attiré l'attention de l'État sénégalais hier lors de LDC Sénégal, où nous avons interpellé les autorités sénégalaises la nécessité de rendre beaucoup plus transparent, inclusif et participatif le processus, comme l'encadre la Constitution du Sénégal.
Yeah, so the amount of the contract is about $2.5 billion. At the moment, implementation should take 3 to 5 years. And the idea is to make Senegal's energy mix more resilient. But what the Senegalese state is offering in return for that deal is not really well known. But yesterday at the launch of Senegal's NDCs, we insisted that it was important to involve civil society so that we discuss and unpack clearly what we are giving up in exchange for this amount of money.
Merci beaucoup, Ibrahima, and to the translator. Now on a bit of touching still on transparency, we're going to go over to Jakarta virtually. Bahima, the working paper has a set of principles that help to maintain national sovereignty, one of which is technological transfer. And we know that you've got a bit of experience with that in Indonesia. We know that technological transfer can be undermined by some of these international investment treaties, and you've had experience with that, especially with the nickel ban and the relationship between that and Indonesia's battery industry. May I please invite you to give us a little bit of information on the JETP in Indonesia and shed a bit of light for us on what happened with the nickel ban where you are as well. Bahima, over to you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Sorry not to join offline there. So thanks for inviting Indonesia CSO to participate in this, I think, very important discussions, because every country in the developing world right now just label itself as JETP recipients. Yeah, apart from Indonesia, we also have Vietnam, Senegal, South Africa. So I think I want to emphasize first about the JETP itself. I think it's similar what Yasira already mentions. I think the JETP scheme itself is more like new structural adjustment programs. And we have a long experience before in Indonesia during the ASEAN financial crisis, when the IMF gave a lot of concessional loans. And right now it's happening again, but under the JETP, with the MDBs, with the IPGs, they give a lot of concessional loans. The number of grants is very, very small, only 1.4% from total 21.5 billion US dollar funding commitments. I think South Africa, you got like 4% of the grants. And the concessional loan itself, I think we need to carefully look at each of the energy transitions project. And what we see here is in Indonesia, many of the IPG, many of the G7 or developed countries try to push their own technologies inside the JETP mechanism. For instance, that instead of funding, giving a lot of debt cancellations, a lot of grants for early retirement of the coal power plants, what Indonesia received is only 2 power plants in the pipeline going to be retired. The other one, the developed countries want to push for carbon capture storage technology, which is considered expensive even for Indonesia or the other developing countries, is unproven technology, but we need to put it in the JETP as part of the solution, which is false solutions in the eye of Indonesia CSO. And the other one, perhaps the Japan, for instance, that one of the leading JETP contributors in Indonesia, they try to push technology like hydrogens, blue hydrogen, green hydrogens, and US, they push for mini nuclear reactors, which is, I think, is very, very problematic and also have a negative impact to the society. So that's a kind of critical or problematic news about current JETP negotiation in Indonesia. And then the good news happens is not part of the JETP, but outside of the JETP, which is, we call it the critical minerals transfer of the technologies, because at the time, Indonesian government tried to ban export of the nickel ores. and European colleague is very angry, and we have like a dispute in the WTO and so on. And until now, the Indonesians still have a dispute with the EU. There is no final results about the WTO dispute about the critical minerals export ban. However, with that kind of conditions, that Indonesian government try to attract more investments, not only to export raw materials because they already banned, but they will bring more technology in Indonesia smelters for aluminiums, for steel industries, and then that nickel process giving a lot of value added to Indonesia economy, giving a lot of fiscal income for Indonesian government, for the local governments, also employ a lot of local peoples. But at the beginnings, the process of the energy transfer perhaps little bit difficult because 90% of the Indonesian smelters business here is dominated by the Chinese company at the beginning. And right now, many of the Indonesian local company already develop new technologies for downstreaming the nickel ores, and also they have collaborations with many of the European companies. So it can prove that with the correct strategies of the downstreamings, correct strategies, how to avoiding kind of dispute mechanisms that push developing countries not to move forward with their own resources, with the value-added processings. I think that's how one country can have more bargaining powers, because energy transitions need a lot of critical minerals. And I think similar with the other colleagues, I think from Africa also, they have cobalt, they also have nickels. Indonesia also have a lot of critical minerals. So how these critical minerals is important things in the global supply chains of the energy transitions, and how the JETP itself learn from the critical minerals process, that any of the collaborations, any of the financings need to ensure that there is a indigenous innovations, there is a local technology contributions, local company, local workers, that it can be said as a just energy transitions, not only just energy transitions. I think that's from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Bima. So, actually, also, and thank you for throwing in that little bit of good news, because so far it was a bit dark. We were hearing lack of transparency, JETP as SAP with lipstick on, loss of sovereignty. It was looking a bit bleak. But you spoke to the export of jobs and that there'll be an element of dumping, and with unemployment, of course, I think that's a great segue to take it back to South Africa. Tando Lukuko, so I'll be handing over the mic to you. Please give us a bit of background on the just energy transition in South Africa and how the JETP slash debt instruments are being positioned in South Africa, and what has been the advocacy pathway issues of debt in South Africa. I know when it started, I think it was 4% grants, but it has right now it's at 1% grants, but I think that's more due to restructuring. But please do share a bit on that.
Thanks, Pado. Good afternoon, everyone. So just quick background. So South Africa's JETP started a few years back before it was announced at COP. Initially, it was just transition transaction, which done the initial number crunching, and then a few years later progressed to what it is that we have now as the 8.5. And then part of the process, with, at least in South Africa's sense, is a very strong social dialogue component, which required that social partners would engage on these various issues, right? So government, business, labor, and ourselves as civil society. The nature of JETPs, at least when we first started to engage with this process, always centered around this government-to-government type negotiations. For us, it was understandable, but of course, because this is a step into a new dispensation, there's always this emphasis on how can all parties or all partners get engaged in the details of what this is going to mean for the country, what it's going to mean for particularly the country's finances, right? Especially in the context of South Africa. I think at the moment our debt to GDP is, I think, between 75 and 80% debt to GDP. So when it was proposed, this 8.5, the bulk of it was still going to be debt. It moved from around 3% with some good advocacy, I guess, on the part of the president. Thank you to him. It moved from about 3% to about 4%. So where it sits now, it's around 4% grant component. But that still leaves a whole 96% of highly concessional loans. Now, this is where our biggest issue was, right? Is to what extent can we try, number one, increase that grant component, because we're living in a country where high indebtedness, high unemployment, high inequality, high poverty are the characteristics of our country. So what does it mean then if, for instance, heaven forbid, South Africa defaults on some of these? What impact does that have on the technology? What impact does it have on the access to the technologies, on access to people, to some of this electricity? So what we did was to try and embed ourselves as a civil society collective, if you will, in some of these structures, so that at least we can begin to get engaged in the details, at least in as far as the partners would allow us to, which I think is the frustrating part. To some degree it happened, and then with that, it allowed us to be able to understand a little bit of the thinking behind what the JP is. And really the single largest components for why the numbers look the way that they do, and honestly they're unimpressive, a big part of it is this triple P and the de-risking component. And this is, I think, remains the single largest contention for many of us, is effectively government is taking away the risk from private sector. Now, we can have a debate around how we feel about this, but ultimately, it cannot be possible that all of the partners who are wanting to make investments in this thing are going to take all of the profits when they are, but take none of the responsibilities if there aren't any. All of that then falls on the citizenry. And so when we're now engaging with JETPs, and I think from a South African perspective, when we're hearing about other JETPs emerging, it's the extent to which then we can engage on how to lessen the component of loans, increase the component of grants, because some of these things we don't yet know how to do, right? And we need an element to say, this is where we're now going to use this kind of money to learn what does it mean in real terms when the JETPs do come online. Another component that is important for us is then how it is that advocacy in itself takes place. We wrote many letters to the president, to the project management unit, to media, to the different partners themselves. Many of our NGOs, colleagues, actually had direct engagements with the IPG, right, to say to what extent can we support the work of the IPG, because as a collective we agree with we're wanting the JETPs to go, but we have our differences on what's the best possible route to get there. For countries that are engaging in this process as well is the extent to which they can engage with some of the IPG partners. And of course we understand that, you know, civil society and just the engagement space in these countries differs from country to country. But I think the key thing is the level of which, again, for me, what is one of the, not the only important one, but one I would like to highlight is this procedural justice component of what the plan is proposing. If justice is the primary tenet of what it is that we're trying to achieve, we have to look at how then do you encourage non-state actors particularly, and non-private sector actors particularly, to get involved in these processes and shape ultimately what these JETPs are going to look like. And so, yeah, this for us is a key thing. As CAAP, which is this project that is part of the brainchild of this, transparency and accountability is a key thing, because then, you know, again, it brings back the question of if things don't go the way that we envision, how then can we partake in a particular kind of recourse? And it's going to be very difficult to undertake that if you were never involved at all in the process and you're just, you know, an external partaker in these things. Yeah, let me pause there for now, Pato.
Thank you, Tando. So I'd now like to bring, because so far we've seen a lack of well, from what you said, we've seen a lack of engagement of civil society. And to bring in, I see that in the room we've got some of our colleagues from the private sector, and we are saying that we haven't been called to play our role. And acknowledging that we do need a just transition, and in that just transition, everyone will have to play a role. What do we see the role of private financiers being, and how big should that role be? Because the person who pays the piper holds quite a bit of power. But how much power should they hold in such a platform? I think we will start. Let's start in South Africa, then Senegal, then we go to Indonesia. Tando?
Merci beaucoup pour votre question. Et effectivement, je pense qu'il y a un rôle extrêmement important à jouer par le secteur privé dans le cadre de cette dynamique globale. À rappeler que le Sénégal a eu un engagement quand même très fort dans le cadre de la production des énergies renouvelables. Aujourd'hui, les efforts consentis par l'État ont permis au Sénégal, dans le cadre de son mix énergétique, d'être à hauteur de 30%. Et les ambitions pour l'État du Sénégal d'ici 2030-2050, c'est d'arriver à 40% du mix énergétique. Et là, quand même, il faut le noter, la stratégie de mobilisation des ressources, des financements de cette stratégie globale pose problème. Et aujourd'hui, on a de plus en plus moins constaté la présence du secteur privé dans le cadre du financement de cette stratégie globale. Et nous sommes convaincus qu'aujourd'hui, les JETP n'arriveront pas à prendre en charge tous les besoins de nos États. Et il est important aujourd'hui d'envisager donc la présence du secteur privé dans le cadre de ce financement. À ce niveau-là aussi, il faudra s'interroger dans le cadre de cet engagement-là et voir en termes de processus comment ce secteur privé, en termes de mobilisation de ressources, peut participer, mais interroger aussi la contrepartie et voir exactement qu'est-ce que ça va nous coûter en fait en termes de dividendes, en termes d'impact autour de cet engagement. Du côté du Sénégal, quand même, nous sommes en train de beaucoup apprendre de l'Afrique du Sud, qui est quand même notre grand frère en termes d'expérience autour de la mobilisation de ces ressources, que ce soit avec les JETP, que ce soit avec d'autres mécanismes donc, mis en place. Nous sommes encore à une échelle beaucoup plus réduite et c'est important, je pense que le secteur privé serait important, que ce soit national, que ce soit international, donc de contribuer au financement de cette approche stratégique globale, mais toujours faudrait-il encore interroger et encadrer tous ces mécanismes d'accompagnement donc, du secteur privé dans le cadre global.
Yeah, so this is an important aspect because the Senegalese state really has been doing all the heavy lifting at the moment. The state has managed to increase the contribution of green energies to about 30%, and it wants to take that to about 40% by 2040. Unfortunately, at the moment, while the state has created the context for the private sector participation to happen, that has not really followed. And this is really the missing link at local level and even at international level. However, we're still trying to learn from South Africa's experience, which was the first to have a JETP plan. And South Africa's experience will inform Senegal in how it structures the framework for the private sector, be it local or international, to participate in its process. And it will also help to have some kind of transparency in the process because this framework should have some kind of transparency clauses.
Merci beaucoup. Bima, the role of the private financiers within the JETP.
Yeah, I think the most important thing is every financial institutions, especially the bank, that commit to finance the JETP projects should also have commitment to cancel out any new financing plan for coal power plant, coal financings, coal mining, transportation related to the fossil fuel, and so on. So that's the first one. The second things, I think in the JETP, the safeguard itself, the project selection itself, it should be not only in the private sectors or MDB sites, but also need to engage with the affected community, CSO, and also local governments, for instance. So every project selections that in the JETP, private sector's interests need to be monitored closely, need to be having like a grievance mechanisms. So any affected communities, as we see that many of the JETP projects is actually large scale renewable energy, which is having a huge risks of social conflict, environmental conflict also, and then how these private sectors also responsible to mitigate this conflict, to mitigate this kind of risks, and also engaging with the local community. And the last things, I think, many of the schemes of the private sectors, less equity financings, more on the commercial loans. And then we just wondering that if Indonesian governments, Indonesia state-owned enterprise, for instance, they borrow money in terms of the JETP to the private financial institutions, I think the JETP itself needs to put clearly how much the level of the interest rate, the level cost of financings to be put in each of the projects. So there's simple terms that if the commercial loans, the rate is similar with the market loans, I think why we need to discuss more about the JETP. So let's do it business as usual. So I think the JETP itself with the right based approach, hopefully it can change the private institution not only seek for higher interest rate, internal rate of return of the each project, but also how it's benefiting the local community and also increasing the renewable energy mix with the proper ways.
Thanks, Bima. I think once again, bringing in the concept that Tando touched on of socialist approach to risk, but capitalist approach to profits. After Tando weighs in, we'll be opening up the floor to questions from the floor. Tando?
Thanks. So I agree with the previous comments made by my fellow panelists, so I won't touch on those. I'll just add one or two that I think are also important to consider. Yesterday I was in a conversation with someone, and they were telling me that there are two particular areas in the world where large utilities are being run by NGOs. Could you imagine that kind of reality, for instance, in South Africa, or in anywhere else, for that matter, where non-profit companies, non-profit organizations are running large-scale utilities, right? The one was in the UK, where they're running some of the water facilities. Other one was in Germany, I think Dusseldorf or something, where they're running their waste. And that was very, very interesting for me. Honestly, it wasn't something that I'd thought about before, up until that conversation. And what's interesting about it is that when we look at it from a practical perspective, the government, at least at a national level, even at a municipal level, oftentimes is either far removed from the immediate side of implementation, or there's a deficit issue, particularly a trust deficit issue sometimes between whichever state or non-state actor and the community wherein these projects are going to be implemented. And you often find that it's these NGOs that have the greatest trust relationship, at least at a community level, right, where a particular project is happening. Now, in such an instance, in my mind at least, it would be to say, how do we then bring all of these parties to the table and we continue to engage? And in that engagement, we've got a plan, for instance, the implementation plan. All these sectors have looked at it from what is it that we're going to be contributing in terms of financing, what are we contributing in terms of tech and skills and so on. And I think even for us, if I could be really picky and say as a civil society sector, there's a component of it where I think we also need to look at it and say, well, how do we throw more skin in the game to complement the skin that's already being thrown by likes of private sector, for instance? It's going to be different because obviously we don't have the kind of balance sheets that a private company has, right? But they certainly don't have the level of access, at least to the community that we have. And so there's trade-offs there. There's something that could be discussed there, and this is where, for me, the grant component comes in, because as we're hearing, for instance, in this COP, the means of implementation is equally important when we're discussing the ends of what it is that we're trying to achieve. And I think that's where the purpose of that engagement between us as partners and stakeholders becomes critical, because then we can really say, as we now begin to implement this just transition, because it's going to be at a project level, what then is it that this person can do, that person can do, that person can do? As a partner, then, and we're talking about now PPPs, I would be able to say, but my friend, I think the terms that you're putting on this table are not necessarily favorable to us. And you can't come back and say, yeah, but Tano, you're not putting any skin in the game. I've got some skin in the game. Sure, it's not equal to yours, but I am putting something, and that has to account for something. And if it can account for something, it has some kind of weighting, then we can begin to really start to engage as partners and, dare I say, as equals in how it is we might be able to achieve the ends of a JETP, because I believe all of us have got a shared end state in mind for some of these just transition.
And thank you for that, Tando. We'll now open up to the floor. Do we have any questions? Okay, we've got a question here. We've got a facial expression on the floor, but I'm not sure if I should point at the person. So we'll start here, and then we'll go there, and then if it's only 3 questions, then we'll take the round of questions, do a round of responses, and close the session. Can you please say your name and possibly association if you'd like to, and go ahead with your question, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kopano, and I'm from the Foundation for Human Rights. My question is in relation to the investment that comes to finance the JP. I just want to know, I know that you did mention that a president did make an effort to raise, raise the grant percentage to 4%. But is there a mechanism that can maybe be adopted to act as a safety net for developing countries to not be further indebted into the investments that are coming into the country to finance the JP? Any mechanisms that have worked, any mechanisms that maybe are yet to be adapted that can be explored within the context of the Global South countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Kopano. I think we had another question there.
Thank you so much. I'm Koile Manahin from Climate Action as well. Mine is just a quick comment on just the foundational way JETPs work and how they're masked as just energy transition when they're happening outside the COP process. This is a deliberate, by design, cherry picking of certain countries to sort of continue the exploitative process and land. I think the speaker from Indonesia was talking about how they're also landing and sort of backward energies in their CCS, stopping sort of critical minerals, stuff like that, that are really around masking renewables and masking it all. So it's a deliberate cherry picking of certain countries to continue this exploitative process. So it's actually quite something we also need to think about and tie it back to the COP in terms of differentiation. What is just, what is fair, what is a fully funded phase out of fossil fuels. So that's something really interesting to sort of note, and if you can comment on that, that'd be cool.
Thank you, Gwahile. Okay. I think then we've got one question on, I like that it's a question that asks for solutions. Which mechanism can we employ? Which mechanism can we employ to ensure that we're not putting developing countries, as per UNFCCC, how would be defined there, further into debt? And then a comment from Gwahile on cherry-picking countries outside and creating spaces outside of the official UNFCCC processes to continue exploitative ways of doing business. I think we've only got 4 minutes left. Can I ask you to comment on those and also throw in your closing words? And because of that, I'll be generous and give you each 2 minutes. And I can see that our audience will be generous with us and also give us 5 minutes. Yes? Thank you for the thumbs up. Ibrahima, please.
Merci beaucoup pour ces interrogations très intéressantes. Effectivement, je pense que c'est un défi très fort pour les États africains, les pays africains, de pouvoir mettre en place des mécanismes pour contrecarrer. Nous constatons qu'aujourd'hui, certaines puissances sont en avance par rapport à l'Afrique. Je me rappelle la dernière fois, le sommet au niveau de Nairobi, où les États africains, dans le cadre des recommandations, avaient demandé en réalité à mettre en place un système de taxation internationale pour pouvoir tirer profit et financer la transition et financer l'adaptation et tout ce qui est impact donc, des changements donc, à l'échelle des États africains, parce qu'on notait que du point de vue des financements au niveau mondial, on ne pouvait capter que 2%. Et je pense que l'Afrique peut mettre en place des mécanismes, mais il y a des préalables. Le premier préalable, c'est de permettre d'abord mettre en place un cadre permettant aux États africains de pouvoir parler d'une seule voix, de pouvoir porter un plaidoyer très fort pour avoir une position commune, mais ça aussi, ça reste un défi extrêmement important. La dernière chose, c'est par rapport effectivement aux commentaires que je trouve très intéressant, parce qu'aujourd'hui, la société civile est en train de critiquer, de s'interroger. Quelle est la contrepartie? Aujourd'hui, le Sénégal a découvert du gaz. Et dans une même perspective, en 2023, on voit que certains États de l'Union européenne, l'Allemagne, la France, la Grande-Bretagne, commencent à mettre sur la table 2,5 milliards d'euros. Quelle est la contrepartie? Est-ce que c'est pour le gaz sénégalais? Est-ce que c'est pour véritablement assurer la transition juste et équitable donc, en termes énergétiques? Donc là, c'est des interrogations que nous, société civile sénégalaise, nous sommes en train de se poser. Quelle est la contrepartie? Quel est le contenu de ce contrat-là? Et pour en finir, hier, j'ai bien apprécié les retours de votre compatriote qui est venu au Sénégal et donner des recommandations extrêmement intéressantes autour de bien regarder le contenu de ces éléments-là, parce que nous avons été en retard dans le cadre de l'exploitation des fossiles et nous risquons encore d'être en retard dans cette perspective avec tout ce qui est énergie verte, tout ce qui est énergie sobre. En tout cas, merci beaucoup pour cette opportunité que vous nous offrez. Je ne veux pas trop en abuser. Voilà.
Now, so regarding what Africa can do, that's a very difficult question because apparently the highly industrialized countries have a step on Africa, and they are putting in place strategies that are really well thought out. At the Africa Climate Summit, African countries complained that they were capturing only about 2% of the carbon dividends and so on, and they asked for a global tax regime that would help them capture more of this, and that is really a step in the right direction. The African continent speaking with one voice. And also regarding the second comment that came in, this is really important that just at the moment when Senegal discovers gas, the IPG comes in with this jet fee of $2.5 billion. Was this really something that had been planned on the side, or did it really come as a consequence of the gas deposits that were discovered? And so it is really interesting, and we appreciate very much the comments of the South African who came to the Senegal pavilion yesterday, because the comment was scrutinize these contracts carefully and make sure that you have done your homework in order not to be locked into a kind of colonial deal.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Translator, quel est ton nom? Roland. Merci. Let's go to Indonesia. I'll give you 2 minutes.
Okay. So what we need to do, I think we need to have strong collective bargaining, and not only just African, but also developing country as well, because I think many of the similar conditions happening. And about that collective bargainings, we need to set out how much portions of the minimum grants, because South Africa, you mentioned from 3%, right now 4%, Indonesia only 1.4%. And many of the grants already included as a technical assistance programs. So the really portions of the grants is really small. And then we need to increase that kind of a grants in the JETP, but with the conditions that this kind of a grant should be involving energy based in the local communities. I think the local communities, energies, renewable energies is excluded in the process of the CIPP JETP, in the process of negotiations. And I think local communities should be addressed as grant recipients, because in many countries, local community already develop the technologies, and it's very simple technology to replicate to the others island, to the other province, to the others village levels. And I think JETP not only talking about the big scales of renewable energies or coal phase out, but also including the community-based renewable energies. I think that's the most important things. And I think we need as a CSO to have further discussions, and also to making, as Yasira mentions, about the toolkit, the safeguard. So every kind of JETP scenarios, whether in the existing JETP recipients or perhaps the others countries that will be having JETP schemes, they're also following the good path, or at least the CSO that already experienced before can share what kind of a just energy transition it should be.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, in the interest of time, if you'd like to know Tando's response to that, please chat to him after this. With that, we come to the end of our session. And I just wanted to say, with the report that we launched today on advocating for rights-based climate investment plans in developing nations to realize a just transition, they do bring, although they call out quite a number of behaviors, what we can also look at, what we can look at this report as is a guide and look to for advice on how to do this well, how to do it in a way that we ensure that we are respecting human rights. How do we collaborate to make sure that we're using the best knowledge, the best available knowledge to get the best deals for our countries in the global south? And with that, I'd just like to say thank you to the audience for attending the launch. The report is available on the IEJ, Institute for Economic Justice website. Thank you to the author, Yasira Mahdi. Thank you to the hosts who put this event together under the Climate Ambition to Accountability Project, which has three partners: the Institute for Economic Justice, South African Climate Action Network, and WWF South Africa. I'd like to thank our hosts, well, not our hosts, but our speakers, Bima, Ibrahima, Tando, and our translator, Roland. And thank you to the South African Pavilion for availing us space. You can look to over there if you'd like to see who has sponsored this and made this conversation possible. And again, my name is Bato Kilisise. It's been an absolute pleasure facilitating this conversation. Enjoy the rest of your COP and take care.